The Sovereign Ascendancy arrived on a Tuesday, and it arrived politely, which was somehow worse. There was no burning sky. There were no cities peeled open, no fires walking across farmland, none of the things that 1,000 years of human nightmares had prepared the species to expect. The Ascendancy simply unfolded itself at the edge of the solar system, the way a man unfolds a legal document on a kitchen table, smoothing the creases with the flat of his hand, taking his time, because the outcome has already been decided somewhere else, and this part is only paperwork. Nell Akanjo was 19 years old and 400 meters underground when it happened, which she would later think was the most fitting thing about it. The Svalbard Deep Index did not look like the last hope of anything. It looked like a mine, because it had been won, and then like a seed vault, because it had been that too, and now it looked like what happened when 3 generations of very stubborn librarians got hold of a mine and refused to leave. Its corridors were concrete and cold-rolled steel. Its lights were the ugly yellow of emergency service. Its air smelled of rock dust and machine oil, and faintly, of the coffee that Idris Van brewed at hours no doctor would have approved of. Nell was on the 3rd sublevel when the alarm sounded, which was not an alarm at all but a soft repeating chime, 3 notes, like a doorbell in an empty house. She had been running integrity checks on Rack 9C, which held 11 million pages of agricultural chemistry, most of it useless, some of it capable of feeding a continent. She had a stylus behind her ear and a smear of graphite on her jaw, and she was thinking, at the exact moment the world changed, about whether the humidity in 9C was drifting up by 0.5%, and whether that was a sensor fault or a real problem. The chime meant the keeper wanted everyone in the long room. She took the stairs, because the lift was slow and she was 19 and had never in her life waited for a lift when stairs existed. The long room was the old machine hall, 200 meters of vaulted rock with a ceiling ribbed like the inside of a whale. Screens hung from the ribs on cables. There were maybe 60 people in the index that week, archivists and engineers and the 3 cooks who ran the canteen with an iron hand, and all of them were standing very still, looking up, and nobody was talking. On the screens was a shape. It was not a ship the way humans built ships. Human ships were arguments with physics, all radiator fins and reaction mass and desperate compromise. This thing was a statement. It was a long dark spindle, 20 kilometers of it, and it turned slowly against the stars with the untroubled patience of a thing that had never once been in a hurry. Around it, in a lattice so regular it looked geometric, hung 91 smaller vessels, and each of those was larger than any object humanity had ever put into space. "That is at Saturn," said Idris Van quietly to nobody. "That is at Saturn as of 9 minutes ago." He was 71, and he had the build of a man who had spent 40 years carrying heavy things upstairs, and he was the keeper of the Deep Index, and Nell had never once seen him look the way he looked now. Not frightened, something more careful than frightened. Then the screens changed, and the Ascendancy spoke. It spoke everywhere at once. In the long room, in the streets of Lagos and Lima and Osaka, in fishing boats in the Andaman Sea, in the cabs of trucks crossing Nebraska, on the phones of children who should have been asleep. It came through every speaker, every radio, every hearing aid, every emergency siren, in whatever language the listener had learned at their mother's knee. And it came in a voice that was neither male nor female nor cruel, a voice like a clerk reading a weather report. "Attention, the technical population of the world designated Terra, Catalog Reference Sol 3, Provisional Tier Assignment 9. You are addressed by the 9th Grant Fleet of the Sovereign Ascendancy, acting under the standing instrument of accession. Your system lies within the projected expansion envelope of the Ascendancy. Under the instrument, worlds within the envelope are offered accession. Accession is not conquest. Accession is administration. Your world will retain its cities, its populations, its cultures, and its languages. Your world will surrender its sovereignty, its orbital rights, its industrial output above subsistence threshold, and the totality of its recorded knowledge, technical and otherwise, to the Grant Office of the Ascendancy, which will thereafter license back to you such knowledge as the office deems appropriate to your tier. The terms are not negotiable. The terms are unconditional. You have 40 hours. At the conclusion of 40 hours, a delegate of your species will present themselves at coordinates to be provided, bearing the instrument signed. Failure to present a signed instrument will be recorded as refusal. Refusal is a category, not a tragedy. Refusal is handled. This message will not repeat. It has been delivered in 3,411 of your languages. The Ascendancy notes your linguistic diversity with interest. The Grant Office will catalog it. Ends. And then the screens showed the ship again, turning, patient, and the long room stayed silent for a length of time that Nell would never be able to measure. And then a woman near the back, Petra from Thermal, who had a laugh you could hear through 2 floors, made a small sound, and it was not a laugh. Nell realized she was still holding the stylus. She looked at it. Humidity in rack 9 C 0.5%. Well, said Idris Van. He said it the way a man says it when he has been expecting a knock at the door for a very long time and has finally heard it. And the strange thing, the thing Nell would turn over in her mind for the rest of her life, was that under everything else in his face, there was something that looked almost like relief. 40 hours is not a long time to decide what a species is. By hour 2, the Ascendancy had provided its documentation, and the documentation was the worst part. It came as a data burst, unencrypted, generous, into every observatory and university and government office with an antenna pointed at the sky, and it was clearly designed by people who had done this many, many times before. It contained a history of the Ascendancy, 19,000 years, 400 member worlds, no dates of conquest listed, only dates of accession. It contained a legal framework. It contained a tier table. Humanity was Tier 9. Tier 9, the packet explained without a shred of malice, was the classification for pre-lattice civilizations demonstrating industrial capacity, symbolic language, and no independent faster-than-light capability. Tier 9 worlds were not enemies. They were not even opponents. They were, in the elegant phrasing of the Grant Office, unaddressed inventory. The packet included, as a courtesy, the standard schedule of accession benefits. A Tier 9 world could expect, within 200 standard years of good behavior, a license to operate gravity-assisted lift infrastructure. Within 400, a limited water cycle synthesis grant. Within 600, possible elevation to Tier 8 and the beginning of medical licensing. 600 years for the beginning of medical licensing. Nell read that line on a tablet in the canteen at 3 in the morning, hunched over a bowl of soup she had not touched, and she felt something move in her chest that she did not have a word for yet. It was not fear. She had been afraid on the walk down from the helipad in a whiteout once, and this was not that. Across the table, an engineer named Sophia Ray-Zedekanal was reading the same line, and she said, very softly, "There are people who could be alive in 10 years, and they are telling us 600. They said cure licensing," said Nell. "They said," Sophia agreed. Idris Van came in and sat down heavily and put his hands flat on the table and looked at them, and said nothing for a while. He had been on a call with the council in Geneva for 6 hours. There were new lines around his eyes. "They will not bomb us," he said at last. "That is the first thing everyone gets wrong. They don't want a graveyard. A graveyard doesn't pay licensing fees." "So what do they do if we refuse?" Nell asked. "They handle it." He turned his cup around. "The packet is very clear that refusal is handled. It does not say how. That is a choice, that omission. That is a very old choice made by very good administrators. They want us to imagine it." He was quiet again. "And are they going to," said Sophia, "are they going to do it, whatever it is?" "We will find out," Idris said, "in about 31 hours. They found out in 9. The Ascendancy did not touch a city. The Ascendancy touched the moon. There was a shipyard at Mare Frigoris, a half-built spine of trusses and printer gantries, humanity's first serious attempt at building large things off-planet. It had taken 11 years and the combined budgets of 4 continents. 216 people worked there. 90 minutes before it happened, every one of them received a personal message on their own private channels, addressed by name, in their own language, informing them that the facility would be reduced at a stated time and instructing them to withdraw to the surface habitats, which were noted as protected structures under the instrument and would not be touched. They withdrew, every one of them. The Ascendancy waited until the last suit was through the last airlock and then confirmed the count. Then it reduced the shipyard. Nell watched the feed from the habitat cameras with 60 people crammed into the long room. There was no explosion. There was a line of light, thin as a pen stroke, that came down out of nothing and simply moved, slowly, the way a person moves a finger through dust, and where it passed, 11 years of work turned into a gray plume and drifted apart in the low gravity, silent, because sound needs air, and the moon has none. It took 4 minutes. It could obviously have taken 4 seconds. The 4 minutes were part of the message. When it was over, the Ascendancy sent a single line of text to every screen on Earth. Nothing living was harmed. Note the ratio of what you build to what we remove, 31 hours. And the thing that broke people, Nell saw, was not the destruction. It was the courtesy. It was the 90-minute warning and the confirmed head count and the protected structures. Because a monster you can hate, a monster you can fight or die fighting, and there is a kind of terrible comfort in that. But this was not a monster. This was a landlord. This was a very old, very tired, extremely competent institution that had done this 400 times before and had gotten very good at it, and had learned over 19,000 years that you do not need to kill people to own them. You only need to make it perfectly, arithmetically clear that resistance is a category of paperwork, and that the paperwork has already been filed. Somebody in the long room began to cry. Somebody else told them to stop. Somebody else told that person to shut up. Idris Van turned away from the screens, and his eyes found Nell across 60 heads, and he tipped his chin toward the tunnel that led down past the 3rd sublevel, past the racks and the humidity sensors and the 11 million pages of agricultural chemistry, to the place at the bottom of the index where Nell had worked for 14 months and had never once been allowed to go. He held up 2 fingers. Level 2, he meant, the old command deck. Nell went. The stair down to the command deck was cut rough, unfinished, and the walls were still marked with the drill patterns of the miners who had made this place a century ago looking for coal. It was, Nell thought, an absurd way to reach the most important room on Earth. But then this whole place was absurd. That was the point of it. Nobody puts the crown jewels in a mine. Idris keyed the door with a physical key, an actual key, cut brass on a loop of string, and Nell almost laughed. Inside was a room the size of a schoolroom. Concrete, 6 chairs, cable trays overhead, a rack of hardware along one wall that was clearly 40 years old and had clearly been maintained with a devotion bordering on the religious replaced boards, hand-soldered, labeled in 4 different handwritings, one of which was shaky and old, and one of which was young and round, and had drawn a small, careful star beside the words Power Bus 2. And in the middle of the room, on a steel pedestal bolted to the rock, was a console. It was not impressive. It was a slab of brushed aluminum with a keyboard, 2 key slots, a small, ugly screen, and under a hinged cover of clear polycarbonate, a single button. The button was black. It was about the size of a plum. It had no label. Nell looked at it for a long moment and felt the hair rise on her arms, and she said, "That's a joke. That's somebody's joke." "It is not a joke," said Idris Van. "It is the least funny object on this planet. Sit down, Nell." She sat. He did not. "You have heard the rumor," he said. "Everyone in this building has heard the rumor. The quiet option, the thing at the bottom of the index. You have all decided among yourselves that it is a bomb or a dead man's switch or a signal to some ally we do not have. Yes. People have said all three," Nell admitted. "Mostly the bomb." "Of course, because that is the only story your species has ever been told about a button." He pulled a chair around and lowered himself into it with the care of a man whose knees had opinions. "A button ends the world. A button is the last word in an argument. A button is a threat you hold to the head of the thing that wants to eat you." He looked at the black plum of it under its plastic cover. "That is not what this is," he said. "This is the opposite of that. And in 31 hours, someone is going to have to decide whether to press it, and I have spent the last 6 hours on a call with 11 governments, and the honest answer is that nobody wants to be that someone." "Then what is it?" said Nell. Idris Van did not answer straight away. He got up and went to the rack and touched one of the hand-labeled boards, the one with the small, careful star beside Power Bus 2, and Nell realized with a lurch that the round young handwriting was his. From decades ago. From when this room was new and he was younger than she was now. "Do you know what the ascendancy actually is?" he said. "Not what it says it is, what it is." "An empire." "Everyone is an empire. That's a word, not a mechanism." He turned. "I have been reading their packet for 9 hours. So have 4,000 other people, and we are all reaching the same conclusion, and it is not the conclusion anyone expected. The ascendancy does not rule 400 worlds with those ships. Those ships are the collection department. You do not need a fleet of 91 to hold 400 worlds. 400 worlds could build 10,000 ships between breakfast and lunch if they wanted to. So why don't they?" "Because they can't afford to," said Idris Van. "Because the ascendancy does not own their planets. It owns their knowledge. Everything those worlds have, their medicine, their water reclamation, their atmospheric processors, their power, their food chemistry is licensed. Every one of them signed an instrument, and on the day they signed it, everything they knew went into the grant office, and everything they needed came back out on a lease. And a lease can be revoked." He let that sit. 400 worlds, he said. Not one of them can build a lung filter without permission. Not one of them can synthesize an antibiotic they invented themselves because they no longer have the file. Not because it was destroyed, because it was filed. And the filing cabinet is 19,000 years deep, and it is the only one there is. Nell's mouth had gone dry. "They're not an army," she said slowly. They are the largest and oldest paywall in the history of the galaxy," said Idris Van. "And 40 years ago, a group of people in this room realized that someday something like them would come, because something like them always comes. And they asked themselves the only question that matters." He put his hand flat on the console, next to the cover. "Not how do we beat them," he said. "How do we make them irrelevant?" The deep index had never been a seed vault. That had been the cover story, and it had been a good one because it was also true. Idris Van explained it to her in the concrete room with the black button under its plastic cover, and he explained it badly, the way people explain things they have carried alone for so long that the edges have worn smooth, and they have forgotten which parts are obvious and which are not. "It started in a bad decade," he said. "It is not a story with a villain, which is why nobody tells it. There was a man, his name is not important, he would have hated being important, who spent 11 years in court trying to make a water filter that somebody else owned the shape of. He lost," Nell guessed. "He won. It took 11 years and he won, and by then the village he built it for had moved." Idris's mouth was a hard line. And he came out of that courtroom and he sat down with a librarian and an engineer and a very unpleasant woman from Lagos who understood contract law better than God, and they started the index. And their idea was simple and it was stupid and it worked. He gestured at the ceiling, at the whole weight of the mountain and the racks above them. Take everything, he said. Every patent that expires, every paper that publishes, every schematic that leaks, every trade secret that dies with a bankrupt company, every folk process, every recipe, every trick that a machinist in Chennai worked out on a Tuesday and never wrote down until somebody asked him. Take it all. Buy it when you have to. Beg for it when you can. Rescue it out of the receivership of dead corporations, and put it somewhere that cannot be bought, cannot be sold, cannot be seized, and cannot be switched off. That's an archive, said Nell. That's just a very good archive. It is the largest archive that has ever existed and nobody has ever heard of it, which was also the point. He smiled without much humor. Do you know what is in this mountain? 940 exabytes. Every published paper in every discipline since the invention of the printing press, in every language, with translations. Every expired patent from every jurisdiction on this planet, and a good deal of what has not expired, held in escrow against the day it does. 400,000 hours of oral technical instruction from craftspeople in 90 countries. The complete manufacturing chain for 2011 essential medicines, from precursor to pill, not the abstracts, Nell, the actual chain, the temperatures and the catalysts and the tricks that never make it into the journal. Water, power, food, steel, antibiotics, vaccines, the whole of it. Enough to rebuild everything humans know from nothing on any continent with hands. Nell sat very still. It was never meant to be used against anyone, Idris said. It was meant for after. After a war, after a plague, after the last bad century, when somebody crawls up out of the wreckage and needs to know how to make penicillin, and there is nobody left alive who remembers. It was insurance against the loss of ourselves. So what changed? Nothing changed, said Idris Van. That is what I am trying to tell you. Nothing changed at all. Something came out of the sky and told us that from now on knowledge is a leasehold. He leaned forward. And it turns out that the insurance we built against losing ourselves is the exact shape of the thing that is now pointing a gun at us. That is not luck. That is what happens when you build a thing to defend the only principle you actually have. He tapped the plastic cover. That button does one thing, he said. It opens the index completely, permanently, to everyone. Nell frowned. We're already the index is open. Anyone can request. To everyone, said Idris Van, not to Earth. To the galaxy. The room seemed to get colder, though it did not. That is not possible, Nell said. We don't have a transmitter that could. We do not, Idris agreed. They do. He stood and crossed to the ugly little screen and woke it, and Nell saw a map she had never seen before. A spray of light, a lattice, thousands of nodes strung across a spiral arm like beads on invisible thread. The relay lattice, he said. It is how the ascendancy talks to itself. It is 19,000 years old and it is beautiful and it is the single most impressive object I have ever had described to me. It is also, structurally, a public utility. It has to be. You cannot administer 400 worlds on a private line. Every registered node in ascendancy space listens to the lattice, always, because that is how the grant office delivers licenses, revocations, updates, price lists, and law. He turned. They dropped a node into our system 11 days ago, he said. Before the fleet, that is standard. It is how they broadcast into 3,411 of our languages, simultaneously, at zero latency. It is how they will deliver our instrument when we sign it. It is sitting in a high orbit right now, drinking our sunlight, an open port on the largest network in the galaxy. Nell understood, and her whole body went cold and then hot. They plugged us in, she whispered. They plugged us in, Idris said, because in 19,000 years and 400 worlds, Nobody has ever done anything with it except listen. It took her 10 minutes to argue herself out of the obvious, and Idris let her, and answered each one, and every answer was worse than the last. They'd cut the node. It takes 11 seconds to authenticate, 40 seconds to propagate to the first 100 relays, and after that it is in the lattice, and the lattice is not a wire, it is a rumor. Every node that receives it holds it. Every node that holds it repeats it. That is the design. They built it to be unkillable because they built it to carry law, and law that can be cut is not law. He shrugged. They could cut our node in 12 seconds, and it would already be too late by 4. They'd have encryption, authentication. We can't just. We can because a girl named Priya Sundaram spent 19 years of her life on it, and she died 2 winters ago, and the last thing she said to me was a joke about how the Ascendancy's key exchange was elegant, ancient, and lazy, like a cathedral with the back door open. His voice did something complicated. They have never been attacked, Nell. Not once. Nobody attacks the water company. They have been standing in a room with the door unlocked for 19,000 years, because it never once occurred to them that anything below Tier 4 could reach the handle. Then why haven't we already? And she stopped, because she saw it all at once, the way you see the shape of a room when the light comes on. Because if we do it, she said slowly, we've got nothing left. Idris Van said nothing. He watched her get there. That's our card. Nell was on her feet without deciding to be. It's the only thing we have, 940 exabytes. They came here for it. That packet, the tier table, the whole thing, they want our knowledge. It's the entire reason they're in the system. It's leverage. It's the only leverage a Tier 9 world has ever had against them, and if we throw it into the sky for free, we can't trade it, we can't bargain with it, we can't hold it over them, we can't. She stopped. Her hands were shaking. We'd be giving them exactly what they asked for nothing. Yes, said Idris Van. That's insane. Yes, said Idris Van, and smiled. And it was the smile of a man who has been waiting 40 years for someone to say that sentence in that room so that he could answer it. Tell me the other plan, he said gently. Go on, there are 3. I have heard all 3 for 6 hours. Tell me one. Nell's jaw worked. We fight, she said. With what? We have 11 armed vessels, and none of them can leave lunar orbit under acceleration. They reduced 11 years of work in 4 minutes, and they did it slowly to be polite. There are 91 of those ships, and there are, per their own documents, 2,300 more elsewhere. We fight and we lose, and then they take the index anyway from the rubble, and the only difference is the number of funerals. Next. We negotiate. With what? Everything we own is what they came for. You do not negotiate with a landlord by offering him the house. And they have said in writing in 3,411 languages that the terms are unconditional. That word is not decoration, Nell. That word is the entire product. 19,000 years of never once bending is why 400 worlds signed. Next. Nell's throat hurt. We sign, she said. Ah, said Idris Van. He sat back down. He looked suddenly very old. Yes, he said. That is the one that is going to win the vote. That is the one that is winning it right now in Geneva as we sit here. And I want you to understand that the people arguing for it are not cowards and they are not fools. They are looking at a species of 9 billion and a fleet that could sterilize a continent by lunchtime. And they are doing the arithmetic that leaders have done for 10,000 years, which is, how many of my people are still breathing at the end of each choice? And on that arithmetic, signing wins. It wins enormously. It is not close. So we sign, and in 600 years they let us have medicine. We sign, said Idris Van, and there is no 600 years. There is no Earth after that, not really. There is a management district with excellent cuisine. Every person born on this planet from that day forward is born owing rent on the contents of their own head. He rubbed his face with both hands. And the index goes into the Grand Office. 940 exabytes, every cure, every process. Everything we ever learned about how to make a life less painful, filed, indexed, priced, and leased back to 400 worlds, at a rate that keeps them exactly as poor as they need to be. He looked up. And that, he said, is why the button is not a bomb. They came for her at hour 22. Not soldiers, the index had no soldiers. A woman from the council's technical secretariat, flown in by helicopter through a storm that should have grounded everything. A small furious person named Adiz Bello who had not slept and made it everyone's business. She wanted the keeper, and she got Idris in the long room with 40 people watching, and she said without preamble, "The vote is at hour 36. Right now it's 61-9 for accession. You need to understand what that means." "I understand what it means." "Then hand over the codes." The long room stopped breathing. "No," said Idris Van. "Keeper," Bello's voice was not unkind, which made it worse. "The instrument requires surrender of the totality of recorded knowledge. If they arrive and the index is not in the inventory, if they find out, and they will find out, they have been reading our networks for 11 days, they will treat it as concealment. Concealment under the instrument is refusal. Refusal is handled." She spread her hands. "You are not protecting anything. You are just deciding which day it burns and how many people are standing next to it." "I know." "Then give me the codes." "I can't," said Idris Van. "You mean you won't?" "I mean I cannot." He said it very simply. "The index has one keeper of record at any time. The console requires a keeper's authentication and a keeper's physical presence, and the reason it requires that is that the people who built it were frightened of exactly this conversation, and they wanted it to be a person in a room with a hand. Not a code you can extract from a man in an interrogation. Not a file you can copy." He put his hands in his pockets. "You can put me in a cell. You would be within your rights, but you cannot get the index out of my head because it is not in my head." Bello's eyes were bloodshot and steady. "Then you will press it. That's what you're telling me. You'll press it before they land." And Idris Van said, "No." Nell's stomach dropped. "I am not going to press it," he said, to the whole room now, to all 40 faces. "And I want to be extremely clear about why. Because there is going to be a great deal of noise in the next 14 hours, and I want at least one true thing said out loud in this building." He walked slowly to the center of the long room, under the whale rib ceiling. "That console can be worked by exactly one person," he said, "and it does not have to be me. The keeper of record is whoever the index has certified, and the index certifies by a process that was designed by paranoids and lawyers, and it takes 4 people and 11 days, and we have 14 hours. A pause. There are 2 certified keepers alive. I am one." He turned his head and looked at Nell Akanjo, 19 years old with a stylus behind her ear. "The other is my apprentice," he said, "who was certified 11 months ago because I am 71 and I had a bad winter and the paranoids, and the lawyers wrote a rule about that too." Every face in the long room turned. Nell felt it as heat, physically, on her skin. "You have got to be joking," Bello said flatly. "I never joke about the index." "She's a child." "She is 19, said Idris Van, "which is the age at which every generation of this species has historically been handed a rifle and told to hold a line, and I have never once heard a government call that a scandal." His voice had gone very quiet, and it carried anyway. "I am not going to press it because if I press it, then it is an old man's decision, and it is a fait accompli, and every person on this planet spends the rest of history saying it was done to them. That is not how this can happen. That is exactly how the Ascendancy does things: one office, one signature, no one asked." He looked around the room and back at Nell. "If we do this," he said, "it has to be chosen, in the open, by someone who will have to live in the world afterward longer than anyone else in this room. And then she has to be free to say no and mean it, and we will all abide by it." The silence went on for a long time. Then Nell said, in a voice that came out much smaller than she wanted, "That's not fair." "No," Idris Van agreed, "it isn't. Nothing about the next 18 hours is going to be fair to anybody. Welcome to the mountain." She went up to the surface, which she was not supposed to do, because there was a blockade and there were things in the sky and the council had told everyone to stay inside. It was 3 in the morning and the polar night was absolute, and the cold came through her coat like a rumor of the vacuum overhead. She stood on the concrete apron by the old mine head with her breath going up in a plume, and she looked at the sky. You could see them, that was the thing. You could see them with the naked eye, 91 of them, arranged in a lattice so precise it looked drawn, moving very slowly across the field of stars, and they did not blink like satellites. They were steady. They looked more than anything like a page of type. Nell had grown up in Enugu until she was 8 and then in a wet gray town in Yorkshire, and both places had been full of people telling her what she was not going to be. She had been rated over and over by people with clipboards, and the ratings had been fine, and fine was the worst thing you could be, because fine meant nobody expected anything, and so nobody would ever be surprised. Tier 9, she thought, unaddressed inventory. There was a word for what she was feeling, and she found it standing on the concrete in the dark, and the word was not fear, and it was not courage either, because courage was a thing in stories and this was not a story. The word was refusal. Not the loud kind, not a fist. Just the flat, quiet, immovable no of a person who has been told exactly what she is worth by someone who has never once bothered to look at her, and who has decided, without drama, without a speech, without any real hope of winning, that she is simply not going to agree. She stood there until she could not feel her hands. Then she went back down into the mountain, because the humidity in Rack 9C was drifting, and somebody had to check it, and it was still, as far as she was concerned, her job. The Ascendancy sent its envoy at hour 28, and the envoy was not what anyone expected. The shuttle came down through the storm at Svalbard, which was itself a message. They had chosen the index, out of every place on Earth, which meant they had known about the mine for some time, and had simply not considered it interesting enough to mention. It landed on the apron by the mine head in a wash of snow that did not melt, because whatever held the craft up was not hot, and the ramp came down, and a single figure walked out into the polar dark. She was tall and thin, and her skin was the gray-green of weathered copper, and she had 4 eyes arranged in a shallow arc, and she wore a long coat of some fabric that shed the snow before it landed. She was unmistakably exhausted. She carried a flat case under one arm. "I am Adjutant Sesh of the 4th Cohort," she said in English, and her voice through the translator was warm and tired and had the particular flatness of someone reciting a phrase they have said 400 times. "I bear the instrument of accession for the world Sol 3. I am authorized to explain its provisions, to witness its signature, and to answer questions of clarification. I am not authorized to negotiate because there is nothing to negotiate. May I come in? It is very cold, and I am not built for it." Nobody had planned for that. Adiz Bello, who had planned for everything, blinked twice and said, "Yes. Come in." They gave her tea in the canteen, because it was 3 in the morning and the canteen was the only warm room, and because humans, faced with the end of their sovereignty, will still offer you something hot. Sesh held the cup in both hands, which had 6 fingers each, and looked at it for a while before drinking. "This is not poisonous to me," she observed. "That is fortunate. In 109 of these it has been." "You've done this 109 times," said Nell, who was standing by the urn because nobody had told her to leave and she had made herself very small. The 4 eyes moved to her. 411 times, said Sesh. "Not accessions. Accessions are rare. Deliveries, notices, revocations, adjustments of tier. I am a courier of the Grand Office. It is what my people do. A pause. It is what my people are permitted to do. Idris Van came in then and sat down across from her, and the room filled up quietly behind him with archivists who had no business being there and were not going anywhere. "You're not Ascendancy," Idris said. "I am absolutely Ascendancy. I have served 22 years. Sesh set down the cup. "I am Ilyari. My world acceded 1100 years ago. We are Tier 6. It is a good tier. We are permitted atmospheric processing, closed-cycle agriculture, and the manufacture of 11 classes of pharmaceutical under license." She said it the way a person recites their own address. "We have very good schools. Our students are permitted to study the theory of any science in the catalog. They may not practice most of them, but they may study." There was a silence in the canteen that had teeth in it. "Adjutant," said Idris carefully, "what is the rust?" Sesh went absolutely still. It was not a human stillness. It was the stillness of something that has learned, over a very long time, that the safest response to a certain kind of question is to become furniture. "That term is not in the packet," she said. "No, it is in the medical annex of your public health filings, which are in the packet in a table of licensing exceptions in a footnote." Idris's voice did not change. "Ilyari hemocytic degeneration, onset in the 4th decade, untreated mortality 100%. There is a treatment. It is grant office property. It is licensed at Tier 4 and above." "That is correct." "You are Tier 6. "That is correct." "How many?" said Idris Van. Sesh's 4 eyes closed, one pair and then the other. 900,000 a year, she said. "It is not a plague. It is very slow and very ordinary. It is simply what happens to us at the end if we are not treated. My mother is in her 4th decade. She opened her eyes. "I have applied 19 times for compassionate exception. The office is not cruel. The office replies each time promptly with a full explanation of the tier schedule and an estimate of when Ilyara may expect elevation. The current estimate is 240 years. Nobody in the canteen moved. "The molecule," said Sesh quite calmly, "is not complicated. I have been told this by physicians. It is not a difficult thing to make. It is a difficult thing to be allowed to make. Those are not the same difficulty, and it took me a very long time to learn the difference, and I do not enjoy explaining it to strangers at 3 in the morning." She picked the cup back up. "May I have more of this?" she said. "It is not poisonous and it is warm and I am 41 years old." Nell made her the tea. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. She said quietly while the water ran, "Do you want us to sign?" Sesh did not answer for a long moment. "I am not authorized." "I know what you're not authorized to do," said Nell. "I asked what you want." The adjutant looked at this small human girl with graphite on her jaw, and something in the set of her shoulders changed, minutely, the way a wall changes when a single brick is removed. "I want you to sign," Sesh said, "because I have watched a world refuse once and I have not slept properly since. Refusal is handled. I would rather you were alive and poor than principled and gone. That is what I want. It is a small, cowardly, sensible thing to want, and I have wanted it for 22 years and it has kept me sane." She drank. "And I have carried the instrument to 100 worlds," she said. "And there is a part of me down where the office cannot audit that has spent my entire life waiting for somebody to do something else." The vote came at hour 36. It was not held in a chamber with flags. There was no time for chambers. It was held across 19 linked feeds, and it lasted 90 minutes, and Nell watched the whole thing on a cracked tablet in the long room, sitting on the floor with her back against a rack of coolant pipes, and it was the least dramatic thing she had ever seen, and it broke her heart. They were not villains. That was what Idris had said, and it was true. They were tired people in bad lighting doing arithmetic. A delegate from Chile explained, in a voice that kept cracking, that 70,000 people currently on dialysis would go on receiving it under the instrument, and that this was, in the end, the only number she was able to hold in her head. A man from Bangladesh talked for 11 minutes about coastlines. Someone from Norway wept openly and voted yes and apologized for weeping. The ones who voted no were not heroic either. Some of them were angry in a way that had nothing to do with principle. One of them shouted. And then at the end the tally, accession 73, refusal 4, abstain 12. And the Council of Earth, by an overwhelming majority, agreed to the unconditional surrender of the human species. Nell sat on the floor with the tablet in her lap and did not move. Somewhere above her in the long room somebody put a hand over their face. Somebody else said, "Well, that's that then," in the voice of a man closing a shop for the last time. And Adiz Bello, who had flown through a storm and not slept in 2 days, came and sat down on the floor next to Nell, which was not a thing that women from the technical secretariat did, and stared at the wall with her. "I voted yes," Bello said after a while. "In my recommendation, I want you to hear it from me. I know. I have a son, he is 6. Bello's voice was perfectly level. "That is not a justification, it is just the truth, and I would rather say the true thing than the noble one." Nell nodded slowly. "They asked me to come here and take the codes off an old man," Bello went on, "and I would have. And I came down that stair and I saw a mine full of librarians and a button in a concrete room, and I thought, this is the stupidest thing I have ever seen, and then I read the manifest." She turned her head. 940 exabytes. "Do you know what is in there, really?" "Everything," said Nell. "Everything," Bello agreed. "And here is what has been eating me for 6 hours." She held up her hands, cupped as if holding something. "If we sign, they take it. All of it. Not to destroy, they don't destroy anything, that's the horror, they take it and they file it. And in 100 years there will be a world 4,000 light years from here, a world nobody on Earth has ever heard of, and somebody there will be dying of something small and stupid, and the cure will be sitting in an office priced, and the reason it is priced is that we handed it over on a Thursday to keep our dialysis machines running." She lowered her hands. "And we will never know. That is the part. We will never even know their names." Nell said nothing. "I still voted yes," said Adiz Bello. "I know," said Nell. "I am telling you," Bello said, "because I want you to understand that the vote was right, and I want you to understand what it costs, and I want you to understand that those are both true, and I do not have any idea what a person is supposed to do with that." She got up. "The delegation flies to the coordinates in 90 minutes, she said. "They want a keeper of record on the manifest to certify the index handover. Van is too old for the flight profile." She looked down at Nell. "So they are sending you," said Adiz Bello. "Congratulations. You are going to be the human being who signs away the human race, and you are 19, and I am so sorry, and there is nobody else." Idris Van was in the concrete room, sitting in front of the console with his hands folded, when Nell came down the rough-cut stair for the last time. He did not look up. "They told you," he said. "They told me. Sit down." She sat. The button sat under its plastic cover, black and dull and about the size of a plum, and she looked at it and felt nothing much at all, which frightened her more than anything else had. "I want to tell you what happens if you press it," said Idris Van. "Not the philosophy, the mechanism. Because you are going to be on a shuttle in 90 minutes, and you deserve to know exactly what you are declining to do." "All right." He woke the screen. 11 seconds to authenticate against their node. That is the whole of Priya's life's work, and it will be over before you finish exhaling. He touched the map, the spray of light, the lattice. Then the index begins to move. Not all at once. 940 exabytes is not a message. It is a migration. It goes in tranches by priority, and the priorities were argued over for 11 years by people who are mostly dead now. "What's first?" "Medicine," said Idris Van. "Medicine is first. It was never even a discussion." 2011 manufacturing chains, precursor to pill, with substitutions for 11 common biochemistries, because we were not stupid enough to think everyone out there was carbon and water in the same proportions we are. Then water, then power, then food, then materials, then everything else in a long tail that will take about 6 of our days to finish, and it will finish, because the lattice does not forget and it does not stop. And it goes to everyone, said Idris. That is the part I need you to hold in your head, Nell, because it is the part that people cannot hold. Not to the resistance. There is no resistance. Not to allies. We have none. It goes to every registered node in ascendancy space, which means every world, every station, every relay, every hospital, every school, every shipyard, every farm, and every warship in that fleet over our heads, including the flagship, including the overseer's private study if he has one, and I imagine he does. Nell stared at him. We'd be giving it to them too. We would be giving it to them first, in a sense, their closest. Idris smiled, and it was a strange, fierce, delighted thing. Do you see it yet? No. Then listen. He leaned in. There is no weapon in this room. There is no way to make them stop. There is no way to make them leave. There is no way to make them sorry. Those are the 3 things a bomb does, and we do not have a bomb, and if we did we would only be a smaller version of them with worse manners. He put a finger on the plastic cover. What this does, he said, is make them unnecessary. Unnecessary. An empire that rules by owning the only copy, said Idris Van, has exactly one vulnerability, and it is not a shield generator, and it is not a fleet, and it is not a throne. It is the word only, and only is not a physical law. Only is a claim, and a claim can be answered in 1 second by anybody anywhere who is willing to give up being the only one who has it. Nell's breath had gone shallow. 400 worlds, she said. 400 worlds that cannot make an antibiotic without a license, and who wake up tomorrow with a complete antibiotic manufacturing chain in every public terminal on the planet, free forever, with no fee, no tier, no schedule, and no way on this side of God for the grant office to take it back. Idris's voice was shaking now, an old man's voice, and he did not care. And a note attached explaining precisely who has been standing between them and it for 19,000 years, and what it cost them, and what it cost their grandmothers in numbers from the Ascendancy's own filings, which are in the packet they gave us for free 11 hours ago, because they could not imagine anyone reading it that way. He sat back. Nobody dies, he said, not one person. Not one of their crews, not one of ours, not a shot fired. The ships stay flying. The overseer keeps his fleet and his rank and his beautiful ancient spindle. He can still burn this planet down to the mantle if he wants to, and the button does not stop him. It cannot stop him. Then what does it do? Nell whispered. It makes it pointless, said Idris Van. It takes the thing he came here to steal and it hands it to every single person he has ever stolen from, and after that, burning us changes nothing at all. He can have his revenge or he can have his empire, and he cannot have both, and he is going to have about 4 minutes to work out which. The room was very quiet. And if he chooses revenge, said Nell. Idris Van looked at her for a long time. Then 9 billion people die, he said, and 400 worlds have the cure for the rust, and I do not know how to weigh that, and I am not going to insult you by pretending I do. I have carried this for 40 years, and I have never once been sure. That is why I will not press it. He stood up stiffly, and put the brass key on its loop of string down on the console beside the plastic cover. You have 80 minutes before your flight, he said. You are the keeper of record. Nobody in this building will stop you, and nobody in this building will help you, and if you get on that shuttle and sign that instrument, I will shake your hand and mean it, and I will go upstairs and check the humidity in 9C, because it has been drifting and somebody has to. He walked to the door. They raided us, he said, without turning around, before they ever spoke to us. 9. They did the whole arithmetic of what we are worth from orbit in an afternoon, and they filed it. He put his hand on the frame. The only thing they never put in the arithmetic, said Idris Van, is what a thing that has been counted out does when it decides not to fall down. And he left her there, alone with the button. She did not press it. Not then. She sat in the concrete room for 51 minutes with the brass key on its loop of string in her fist, and she did not touch the cover, and she thought about a great many things that were not relevant, which is what a mind does when it has been handed something too large to hold. She thought about her grandmother's hands, about a school gymnasium in Yorkshire that smelled of rubber, about the humidity in rack 9C, 0.5%, sensor fault or real problem, a question that had a right answer and could be resolved by an afternoon of patient work, and she wanted, with a longing so violent it made her eyes sting, to go and resolve it. She thought about 70,000 people on dialysis in Chile. She thought about a 6-year-old boy she had never met. She thought about 900,000 a year, slowly at the end, if they are not treated, and how the woman who said it had said it in the same voice a person uses to report the weather, because there is no other voice available after the 20th year. And when the 51 minutes were up, she stood and put the key in her pocket and went up the rough-cut stair, and out through the long room where nobody looked at her and everybody watched her, and up to the surface, where the delegation's aircraft was turning over on the apron in the blue-black dark with its lights sweeping the snow. Because she had decided that she was not going to make this decision in a hole in the ground, on the word of an old man she loved. She was going to go and look at them first. Adjutant Sesh was waiting at the ramp with the flat case under her arm and her long coat shedding snow, and beside her stood Adiz Bello, and behind Bello, 3 delegates from the council with the gray faces of people who have not slept and are about to become historical footnotes. Bello held out a tablet. Keeper's certification. It's the index manifest. You sign as keeper of record, confirming the inventory, and it transfers with everything else. Nell took the tablet. She looked at it. 940 exabytes, expressed as a number, which is the only way an institution knows how to express anything. Adjutant, she said, not looking up, what happens to it? Sesh's 4 eyes blinked in their slow, offset way. The index. It will be received by the grant office. Catalogued, assessed, cross-referenced against the standing catalog for novelty. A pause. It will be a very significant intake. I have read the summary. There is material in there that the office does not have. Your species is, you have been very productive for a tier 9 and very disorganized, which is the same thing said twice. And then it will be licensed, said Sesh, according to schedule. To Ilyara. The adjutant did not answer. You said the molecule isn't complicated, said Nell. The one for the rust. You said it's not hard to make, it's hard to be allowed to make. I said too much. It is very late and I am 41 years old. Nell looked up. The sky over Svalbard was clear for the first time in 3 days, and the 91 were up there, arranged in their lattice, moving very slowly, steady, not blinking. Like a page of type, like a filing system. Adjutant, she said, what happens if we refuse? You will not refuse. Your council has voted. I'm asking what happens. Sesh was quiet for a moment. The engines whined behind them. The snow blew sideways. There is a protocol, she said. It is called reduction to instructive standard. It is not a massacre. The Ascendancy does not massacre. The Ascendancy has never once needed to. Her voice was flat and careful, and each word cost her something. Industrial capacity is removed. Orbital capacity is removed. Grid capacity is removed. Population is left intact and is thereafter dependent, and the dependency is the instruction, and the instruction is legible from 4,000 light-years away, and it lasts 1,000 years. She looked at the ships. I have seen one world under instructive standard. They were not dead. They were farming by hand on a world that had a space program, and they were being taught, very patiently over centuries, what the word unconditional means. So it's worse than dying. It is not worse than dying, said Sesh sharply. I have never understood why your kind says that. It is much better than dying. Everyone is alive. Everyone is simply nothing forever, and it is survivable, and that is the horror of it, that it is completely survivable. Bello's jaw was set. Nell. The tablet. Nell looked down at the tablet. And then she looked at Sesh, and asked one more question, and it was the question that decided the shape of the next 10,000 years, though nobody standing on that concrete apron knew it. Adjutant, she said, in 19,000 years, has anybody ever given anything away? Sesh's head tilted. I do not understand the question. Given, said Nell, not traded, not licensed, not leaked. Given, everything they had to everyone for nothing on purpose. The adjutant stood in the blowing snow with the instrument of accession under her arm, and her 4 eyes moved across the face of this 19-year-old human, and something happened in them that the translator had no word for. No, said Sesh of the 4th cohort. There is no procedure for it. There's no procedure for it, Nell repeated. There is no procedure for it, Sesh said again, softly, and it was not agreement. It was something a great deal more dangerous. It was a woman hearing a lock click in a room she had been sitting in for 22 years. Nell handed her back the tablet. She did it gently. She was not making a speech. She was, in fact, so calm that Bello would later describe it to a room full of historians as the most frightening thing she had ever witnessed, more frightening than the ships, because the ships at least had the decency to be enormous. I'm not coming, said Nell Akanjo. Nell. You should still go, she told Bello. All of you should still go. You have a mandate and you should honor it, and if I'm wrong, you'll be the reason there's anything left. I'm not asking anyone to follow me, and I'm not stopping anyone. She pushed her hands into her pockets, and one of them closed around a loop of string and a piece of cut brass. I'm just not signing. You do not have the authority. No, Nell agreed. I have exactly one authority. I'm the person the index will let into the room. She was already walking backward toward the mine head. That's all. That's the whole of it. And I've decided I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being the girl who was in the room. They will burn us, said Adiz Bello, and her voice cracked straight down the middle because she had a son and he was 6. Nell stopped. Maybe, she said. And then, because she was 19, and because there was nothing else true left to say, she said, but I've been graded my whole life by people who never looked up from the sheet, and I've had enough of it. And so, I think, has everybody up there. She turned and walked into the mountain. Overseer Primarch Calanth Vor of the 9th Grant Fleet watched the human delegation's aircraft lift off the ice with 3 of its 5 seats empty, and felt, for the first time in 11 decades of service, a faint and unwelcome curiosity. He was 140 years old, and he had presided over 19 accessions. He was not a cruel man. He had never, in his life, given an order that killed a civilian, and he was quietly proud of that in the way of a man who has never had to. Cruelty was inefficient. Cruelty produced insurgencies, and insurgencies produced audits. The keeper of record is not a board, said his adjutant. Reason. Unstated, the delegation's transmission indicates she declined. Vor considered the world below him, blue and white and absurdly, wastefully beautiful, with its impossible oceans and its 3,411 languages. Declined, he said. Yes, Overseer. Note it, said Calanth Vor. It will be a footnote, there is always one. He turned back to the great window and did not think about it again for 11 minutes, which was, as it turned out, 10 minutes and 49 seconds too long. The concrete room was exactly as she had left it. That was the thing Nell could not get over. The most important room in the history of her species, and it had a water stain on the ceiling, and a chair with a wobbly leg, and a rack of 40-year-old hardware labeled in 4 handwritings, one of them shaky and old, one of them young and round with a small, careful star. She sat down. She put the brass key into the first slot and turned it, and a light came on amber, and the ugly little screen woke up. Keeper of record, OKONGON. Certification, active. Index status, sealed. Query, open the index, YN. She sat and looked at that for a while. There was a comm panel on the wall and she thought about using it. She thought about calling Idris or the council or her mother in Yorkshire or anybody who could take a piece of this. She could feel the shape of that thought, the enormous warm gravity of it, the deep human need to make a decision into a committee. She did not use the comm panel, because she understood, sitting there in the amber light, that the entire machinery of the Ascendancy, 19,000 years, 400 worlds, 91 ships, the grant office, the tier table, the schedules, the footnotes, the patient courteous 4-minute demonstrations. The whole vast apparatus was built on one single assumption, and the assumption was that in the end, always, without exception, somebody would do the arithmetic. And arithmetic never gives anything away. "Okay," said Nella Conjo to the empty room. She flipped up the polycarbonate cover. It squeaked. She thought, absurdly, about the humidity in rack 9C 0.5%. Somebody would have to check it. Somebody would have to check it tomorrow, and the day after, and for the next 400 years, because that is what the job is, and the job does not stop being the job just because there are ships in the sky. "Sorry," she said, to 9 billion people and meant it. And then, because it was hers to do, and because nobody had rated her worth doing it, and because she was not going to fall down, she pressed it. 11 seconds to authenticate. In the concrete room, nothing happened. The screen said working. There was no sound. There was no shudder in the rock. Nell sat with her hand still flat on the button and counted, and nothing happened, and nothing happened. And she thought, with a cold, plunging certainty, that it had failed, that Priya Sundaram had been wrong, that 19 years of a dead woman's life had come to nothing, and that she had just refused to sign the surrender of her species for no reason at all. The screen changed. Handshake accepted. Node Sol 3 Alpha, carrier open. Begin Tranche 1. And 400 kilometers above her head, the Ascendancy's own relay node, a machine older than agriculture, dropped into the system 11 days earlier so that an empire could speak to a planet in every one of its languages at once, opened its throat, and began, without the slightest objection, to sing. It went out at the speed of law. That is the phrase that would survive in the end. That is the phrase that 400 worlds would carve into stone, and none of them would agree on who said it first. It went out at the speed of law because the relay lattice had never been built to carry data. It had been built to carry legislation. It had been built 19,000 years ago by people who understood that an empire held together by force is an empire that must be present, and an empire held together by law can be everywhere at once, and had therefore engineered a network that was faster than any fleet, redundant beyond destruction, that every registered node in Ascendancy space was required by statute to receive, cache, verify, and repeat. It had never once occurred to anyone that a statute could be a gift. Tranche 1 was medicine. It reached the first relay in 40 seconds and the first inhabited world in 9 minutes, and it did not arrive as a weapon or a virus or a demand. It arrived the way everything from the lattice arrived, as a routine grant office data package, correctly formatted, properly authenticated, addressed to all nodes, priority, public health. On the world of Keshamer, in a hospital of 11,000 beds, a duty terminal chimed with the tone it used for licensing updates, and a very tired physician glanced at it, expecting a price adjustment, and instead found free, unpriced, unlicensed, untiered, with no expiry and no revocation clause and no fee schedule attached. The complete synthesis pathway for a broad-spectrum antimicrobial, precursor to pill, with substitutions listed for 11 common biochemistries including his own, and beneath it another, and beneath that another. And the file kept scrolling, and it did not stop scrolling, and after a full minute of scrolling he sat down on the floor. On the orbital hab of 10th cadence, a water engineer received the complete membrane chemistry for a desalination process that the grant office had quoted her guild at 400 years of revenue. On the farming moons of the Sharon, where 9 generations had grown a single licensed cultivar, because the license for a second had never been granted, a public terminal in a village square displayed, in the Sharon's own script, the seed-breeding methods of a species none of them had ever heard of, going back 4,000 years, all of it, everything, free. And on Ilyara, Tier 6, world of very good schools, at 11 minutes past the local midnight, every public terminal on the planet, in the schools, in the clinics, in the transit stations, in the long gray dormitories of the courier cohorts, lit up at once with a document the grant office had been sitting on for 1,100 years and had priced at 240 more. The molecule was not complicated. It had never been complicated. It fit on one page. Tranche 2 went out 90 seconds behind the first, and Tranche 2 was the truth. It was not a manifesto. The people who built the index had argued about that for 2 years and had concluded in the end that a manifesto is a thing an empire can answer, and a ledger is not. So they sent a ledger. They sent the Ascendancy's own public filings, the ones that had come to Earth 11 days earlier in a free, unencrypted, generous data burst, designed to impress a Tier 9 world into compliance, cross-referenced, indexed and laid side by side with the newly opened contents of the index, so that any citizen of any world could see, in their own language, in a single view. Here is the disease that is killing your children. Here is the date it was first cured in the grant office's own records. Here is the tier at which the cure was licensed. Here is your tier. Here is the projected date of your elevation. Here is the number of your dead in the interval, taken from your own census, which the office also holds. Here is the molecule. It fits on one page. It has fit on one page for 1,100 years. There was no editorializing. There was not one adjective in the entire tranche. It had been assembled by librarians, and librarians know that the most devastating thing in the world is a correctly sorted table. And at the bottom of it, one paragraph, in 3,411 human languages and 409 others, and it was the only sentence in the whole broadcast that anyone had bothered to make beautiful. This is everything we have. It is not a trade and it is not a threat, and there is nothing you must do to keep it. We are told that our world is worth a 9 out of 10,000, perhaps. But no one asked us what we would do if we were counted out, and this is the answer. We open the door and we hold it open, and we do not close it again. Come in, take what you need. It was never ours to sell. Tranche 3 was the doors. It was the smallest tranche. It was 240 megabytes, which is nothing, which is a photograph, and it was the one that ended the Sovereign Ascendancy. The Ascendancy's entire physical infrastructure, every lease processor, every licensed reactor, every medical vault on every client world, every grain silo, every atmospheric plant, every bonded warehouse, every debt-collared work compound, every locked archive, every sealed door in 400 worlds worth of grant office property, ran on a single proprietary authorization protocol. It was called the Seal. It was 19,000 years old. It was elegant and ancient and lazy, like a cathedral with the back door open. Priya Sundaram had spent 19 years and the whole of her health on it, working from the fragments of ascendancy signal that had been leaking into the outer system for a century and a half, and she had cracked it 11 months before she died, and she had left a note that said only, "It isn't even locked, it's just very far away." Tranche 3 was the master key, published free with documentation to everyone. At 300 on a Tuesday, Galaxy Standard, doors began to open. Not violently. There were no explosions. The doors simply stopped being closed, which is a different thing and a much stranger one. In the bonded medical vault above Keshammer, 40 years of embargoed pharmaceutical stock sat behind a hatch that unlatched itself with a small sound like a spoon in a cup, and two orderlies stood staring at it for a long moment before either of them moved. On the ore moons of Halth, the debt collars, the polite, humane, extremely legal devices that logged a worker's productivity against their family's licensing arrears, all clicked open at once, 90,000 of them in the same second, and a great many people sat down in the dust because their legs would not hold them. Nobody was hurt. That was in the design, too. The Index had shipped the key with a wrapper that would not open reactor containment, would not open airlocks with pressure differential, would not open anything that would kill somebody on the other side. The librarians had thought about that for 4 years. It had been the single longest argument in the building. Everything else opened. Aboard the flagship of the 9th Grant Fleet, Overseer Primarch Calanth Vor stood at his great window and watched the alerts come in, and did not, at first, understand what he was seeing. "Contamination," said his signals officer. "Overseer, the lattice is carrying unauthorized traffic. It is very large. It is originating from the Sol node." "Cut the node." "The node is cut." It was cut 11 seconds after the anomaly on standing protocol. The officer's voice was very odd. "Overseer, the traffic is not coming from the node anymore. It is coming from us. It is coming from every relay in the arm. The relays are repeating it, Overseer. They are repeating it because it is correctly formatted and correctly signed, and statute requires them to repeat correctly signed traffic. It is propagating on the law." Vor did not move. "Suspend the statute." "The statute cannot be suspended from a fleet, Overseer. It requires a sitting of the Radiant Court and 11 days. Calanth Vor looked down at the blue-white world beneath him, at its impossible oceans, and something very cold went through him. And it was not fear of a weapon, because there was no weapon, and it was not fear of an enemy, because there was no enemy. It was the specific vertigo of a man who has just discovered that the ground he has been standing on for 140 years was never ground at all. It was a claim, and somebody, 400 kilometers below him, in a hole in the rock, had simply declined to agree with it. "Weapons," he said, "prepare reduction to instructive standard." There was no answer. "Prepare reduction," said Vor. And still there was no answer, and he turned slowly and looked at his bridge. His weapons officer was a Sharon, from the farming moons, 9 generations of one licensed cultivar. She was standing at her post with her hands flat on the console and her head bowed, and on her screen, beside the firing solution, a public terminal feed from her homeworld was scrolling seed breeding methods in her own script, 4,000 years of them free. His signals officer was Ilyari. His deck surgeon, a man who had served him for 60 years, who had put Vor's own shoulder back together after the Kellendron affair, who had never once in 6 decades been anything but flawlessly correct, was standing in the hatchway with a printout in his hand, and he was weeping without a sound. And Vor knew, in the way you know things you have spent a life not looking at, exactly what was on that page. "Overseer," said the deck surgeon in a ruined voice, "my daughter is 39. The bridge was completely silent. Calanth Vor stood in the middle of it, 140 years old, commander of 91 ships and 2,300 more elsewhere, holder of the instrument, servant of the Radiant Court, and understood that he still had every single one of his weapons and not one hand willing to fire them, and that this had been done to him without a shot, without a threat, without a single insult, by a species that had been rated 9. He could still burn the world. That was the obscene part. He could go down to the batteries himself, alone, and do it with his own hands, and nothing physical in the universe would stop him. And it would change nothing. It would not close a single door. It would not uncure a single child. It would not restore one syllable of the word only. It would simply be the last act of an institution that had already ceased to exist, performed on 9 billion people who had 400 worlds could now see in a correctly sorted table, given away everything they owned for free, and asked for nothing back. He would not be an emperor. He would be a footnote with blood on it. Vor closed his eyes. "Stand down the batteries," he said. He came down alone, 11 hours later in a shuttle with no escort, and he asked for permission to land. And the permission took 40 minutes to arrive because nobody on Earth could work out who was authorized to give it. He walked out onto the concrete apron at Svalbard in the polar dark, and he was very tall, and his uniform was the color of old iron, and he stood there in the falling snow like a monument that had been moved out of its square and did not know where to put itself. Nell Akanjo came up to meet him, because Idris Van had refused, on the grounds that his knees hurt and it was not his day. She was 19. She had not slept in 31 hours. She had graphite on her jaw and a stylus behind her ear, and she was wearing a coat 2 sizes too big that had belonged to somebody's uncle, and she walked out to meet the overseer Primarch of the 9th Grant Fleet with her hands in her pockets, because it was extremely cold. Sesh of the 4th cohort stood at the edge of the apron and watched, and did not come closer, and did not speak, and would not for some time, because 11 hours earlier she had received a message from her mother on Ilyara, and she had not yet finished reading it, and she suspected she never would. Vor looked down at the human girl for a long moment. "You," he said. "Me," Nell agreed. "You had a weapon." "No," said Nell. "You had the only weapon that has ever worked." His voice was not angry. It was something much worse. It was studious, the voice of a man taking notes at his own dismantling. In 19,000 years, 400 worlds have tried force, and sabotage, and secession, and assassination, and every one of them failed, because every one of them was still asking to be given something. You gave. He said the word as if it were a technical term in a language he had just been handed. You gave, and there was no procedure for it, and my empire came apart in 90 seconds. That wasn't the point. It was the effect. "I know," said Nell, "it wasn't the point." Vor was quiet. "Then what," he said, "was the point?" And Nell Akanjo, who had been graded her whole life by people who never looked up from the sheet, stood in the snow at the top of the world and gave the answer that would be taught in 400 languages, for as long as there were schools. "You told us what we were worth," she said. "You did the whole sum in an afternoon, and you filed it, and then you came here and asked us to sign it. And the thing is, you might have been right. Maybe we are a 9, I don't know, I'm 19, I'm not qualified." She shrugged inside the too big coat. "But nobody asked us. And when nobody asks you and they just hand you the number and expect you to lie down, you don't have to be strong to refuse. You don't have to be clever, you just have to not agree. That's all it is. It's the smallest thing in the world. Anybody can do it." She looked up at him. "So we didn't fight you," she said. "We didn't threaten you. We didn't take anything from you, and nobody died, and you can go home with all 91 of your ships." A pause. "We just stopped being the only ones who had it. And it turns out that's all your whole empire ever was. It was a very long, very patient, very polite way of being the only one who had it." The snow came down between them. "There were 900,000 a year," said Nell. "On one world. That's the number I couldn't put down, that's the whole reason. It wasn't a strategy. It was a number I couldn't put down." Vor stood in the dark for a long time. Then slowly, with the care of a man performing an act for which there is no protocol and never has been, The overseer Primarch of the Ninth Grant Fleet reached inside his coat and took out the flat case that held the instrument of accession for the world Sol 3, and looked at it, and let it fall into the snow, where it lay unopened. "I am 140 years old," he said. "I have never given anything away." "It's not hard," said Nell. "No," said Calanth Vor. "That is what I am going to have to live with." The Ascendancy did not fall the way empires fall in stories. There was no burning capital and no toppled statue and no last stand at a gate. It simply became, over the following 4 years, unnecessary and then quaint, and then a subject that historians argued about. The Grant Office continued to exist for some time as a licensing body with nothing to license, and then as a records office, and finally, in a piece of irony so complete that no one could bring themselves to comment on it, as a library, open to the public free. Kashamar cured its own children in 14 months. The Sharon planted 11 new cultivars in the first season and lost 9 of them, disastrously, and did not care in the slightest, because losing crops you chose yourself is a completely different experience from harvesting one you did not. On Ilyara, world of very good schools, the first locally manufactured dose of the rust treatment was administered in a coastal clinic on a wet gray morning, and the woman who received it was 61 and had been told twice that she would not see another spring, and she was Adjutant Sesh's mother, and the only remark she made was that the injection stung. And no one, anywhere in any of it, was ever charged a single thing. They tried to give Nell Akanjo a great many honors, and she declined most of them, not out of modesty. She had very little of that, but because she was extremely busy. The Deep Index had become, overnight, the most visited place in the galaxy. Ships came. That was the thing nobody had prepared for. Within 8 months there were vessels in Earth orbit from 90 worlds, and none of them had guns, and all of them had cargo, and the cargo was not tribute. It was contributions, because it turned out that 400 worlds, filed and tiered and licensed for 19,000 years, had never stopped learning things. They had simply never been permitted to file them. And now here was a mountain in the far north of a Tier 9 planet with a very old door, and a sign on it that a 19-year-old had written in marker on a piece of cardboard. And the sign said, "The Index, everything we know, take it. Leave what you learn." It was, everyone agreed, an appalling sign. Adiz Bello had a proper one made, in 11 languages, cast in bronze. The cardboard one stayed up next to it. Nell would not let anyone move it. Idris Van lived another 6 years, long enough to sit in the long room under the whale rib ceiling and hear a Sharon agronomist and a Chilean nephrologist, and an Ilyari physician arguing furiously about protein folding in 3 languages at once. And he said, to no one in particular, that it was the worst noise he had ever heard in his life, and he would like it to continue forever. Sesh of the 4th cohort resigned her commission and did not go home. She ran the Index intake desk for 30 years, and was, by universal agreement, the rudest and most efficient librarian in the known galaxy. And when new arrivals asked her whether she had really been there, on the night, she would say that she had watched a human child ask her a question that had no procedure, and that it was the most terrifying moment of her life. And Calanth Vor went home to a court that no longer had anything to give him, and lived quietly, and 40 years later a package arrived at the Index with no note, and it contained the Ascendancy's private navigational survey of the relay lattice. 19,000 years of it, every node, every dark channel, the last great hoard in the galaxy, unpriced, unlicensed, given. Nell filed it herself. She was 59 by then. She catalogued it under public, which was the only category the Index had ever had. But that was all afterward. On the night itself, when the tranches were still going out and the doors were still opening, and the overseer's shuttle had lifted off the ice, and the whole sky was very quiet, Nell Akanjo went back down the rough-cut stair, past the concrete room with the black button that would never be needed again, past the long room where 60 people were watching a galaxy come apart and put itself back together on a hanging screen, down to the third sublevel, to rack 9C. She got out her stylus. She checked the sensor. It was drifting. 0.5% and rising, and it was not a fault. It was a cracked gasket on a coolant line, small and stupid and entirely fixable, and it would have ruined 11 million pages of agricultural chemistry inside of a year if nobody had bothered to look. She fixed it. It took her 4 hours and she cut her hand. And that is what she was doing, a 19-year-old girl in a mine, on her knees on a cold floor, with a torch in her teeth and blood on her knuckles, fixing a gasket nobody would ever thank her for, while every world in the arm of the galaxy opened its doors, and stood in the light coming out of them and looked up, and finally, for the first time in 19,000 years, asked out loud what else might be possible. They had demanded her planet's unconditional surrender. She had given them everything instead, and kept the one thing they came for, which was the right to decide what she was worth.